I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. If you're not familiar with Zoom, please go ahead and make sure that you're muted and you stay muted unless you're speaking. We will have some Q&A later on. The chat window is enabled. We'll be using it for some interaction later on, so just be aware of that. And we'll also be using polls, which will pop up on your screen when the presenter is ready to have you answer them. So watch out for those. Camera on is great, so we can see that you're here with us, but if you have to turn it off, we understand. Please go ahead and turn it off if you have to be moving around or you have a distracting environment. Otherwise, we'd love to see you. At this point, I want to welcome you to this joint program between the Fond du Lac Public Library and our History at Home series and the Badger Talks Live program. And through Badger Talks Live, we're able to present this session tonight on the languages of Wisconsin. Our presenter, Joe Salmons, is the Lester W.J. Smoky Seifert Professor of Language Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also co-founder of the Center for Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures and edited Diachronica, an international journal for historical linguistics, for 17 years until 2019. He's the author of 2 books, A History of German, What the Past Reveals About Today's Language, and Sound Change, which was published just this year. His research focuses on speech sounds and language change. So we're in very good hands for tonight's presentation, sort of exploring the map of Wisconsin languages, past and present. And I also understand that Professor Salmons has invited a couple outstanding grad students who will touch on their work as well, and I'll let him introduce them at the appropriate time. So with that, welcome, Professor Salmons, and I'll let you take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having us. We're really happy to be here. We've missed doing public talks. It's been a long time, and this is a nice chance to get started back to them. We really wish, though, that we were actually in Fond du Lac. I haven't been there in almost 2 years now, and would love to be there. This work is very much collaborative. We have a large group of students and faculty on campus working on the various languages of Wisconsin. And like Josh said, 2 of our outstanding doctoral students are going to be co-presenting tonight. I'll introduce them soon. These talks are not only a chance to meet with people across the state, they also drive a lot of our research, as I'll give an example of soon enough. So first, though, a little quiz, and I guess I have to, oh no, I don't. I'm going to ask a couple of questions in the poll, true false questions. The first one is there now. If you could just click on whether you think that statement is true. English is the official language of Wisconsin. Outstanding. 7 of 9 people said that it's false. In fact, it is false. We do not have an official language in Wisconsin. Here's another true false question. Wisconsin used to print government documents in English and in other languages. Outstandingly informed audience. The answer is yes, it's true, especially in German and Norwegian. Third question, again, a true false. Bilingualism makes you smarter in the sense that bilinguals enjoy clear cognitive advantages over monolinguals. So this one might be a little bit more complicated. It's the scientific research is pretty good on this, but it is still not completely beyond challenge. there are good indications that it does make you smarter in ways that aren't connected to language. So non-linguistic cognitive tests show bilinguals doing better. And bilinguals also fare better with dementia as they get older, have stronger cognitive function later in life. The last true-false question, something that we'll talk about a little bit more, is whether immigrants to Wisconsin in the 19th century typically earned English very quickly. Outstanding. These are results better than I get when I do this with students on campus. It is true, and we'll give you some data on this point pretty soon. Okay, so a couple of other questions that are not true-false questions. There's a sign on the screen. What are the languages on the sign? You could use the chat, and you can chat directly with me if you don't want to say it to everybody. This is a sign that hangs in St. Vincent de Paul in Madison, and it has 4 languages on it. Anybody willing to take a shot in the chat? Excellent. Yes. Spanish, Hmong, English, of course, is the first one. Anybody know the 4th one? The 4th one is Ho-Chunk, the traditional language spoken in this area. So it's an acknowledgement of 2 of the largest immigrant refugee languages in the area, and the traditional indigenous language of the area. Thank you. Second question is a real question. Whose traditional land is Fond du Lac owned, and who traditionally lived close by? And it's a real question because the sources that I know have somewhat different answers to the question. Anybody willing to put that in the chat? Okay, I will show you a map soon that has one possible answer. In some parts of the state now, as people increasingly do land acknowledgements, it's become common in a lot of places to say this is a traditional home of, and list the relevant groups of people. So in the case of Fond du Lac, it would probably be Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Potawatomi, maybe Meskwaki, the people who are traditionally called the Fox. The last one, I won't even try to make you answer it on screen. What are the most commonly spoken languages in Wisconsin? And I'll just give you the answer right here. This is from the American Community Survey, which is a really good source, kind of the best source for these purposes. You see that about half of the people who report, a little over half the people who report speaking another language at home speak Spanish. Large number of Hmong speakers, German speakers, and it starts to drop off. Some languages that might surprise you. I think some people don't realize how many Old Order Amish and Mennonites there are who speak Pennsylvania Dutch at home. And you see Dutch and Norwegian at the bottom of this list. This is just a few examples from the survey data. So what we'll do, we'll talk for probably about 35 more minutes. And I'll talk a little bit about revitalization of indigenous languages in the state, where really exciting things are happening. Earlier immigrant languages, the languages that people often associate with state history, more recent immigrant and refugee languages. I'll say just a word about why people switch to English, and then we get to the part that is most exciting, ongoing research that Mirva Johnson and Rachel Hippis are doing on Finnish and Dutch, respectively, and then Q&A, which is kind of why we're in this game. So if you look at historical maps, this is based, this is a reworking of a classic map on Midwestern Indigenous history. You see that Ho-Chunk is listed as the language, shown as the language in your part of the state. But if you look at this, you'll see that there have been some changes here. This is before the Oneida were in Wisconsin. The Meskwaki are now in Iowa. The Stockbridge Munsee are now in the state as well. But of course, today the situation looks very different. If you look at areas where languages are spoken, they're obviously much smaller, but even this masks a whole lot of really important information. So Menominee has at least one native speaker. There are a couple of speakers of some of the other languages, Oneida and Potawatomi, but small numbers of first language speakers, maybe a couple of hundred Ho-Chunk speakers, and so forth. So how did this come about? Well, if you've been following the news and giving your answers to the poll questions, I'm guessing that this is an extremely well-informed group. You have heard the absolutely horrific stories coming out of Canada about unmarked graves in what in this country are known as boarding schools. This was a movement that was started by Richard Henry Pratt. You can see his motto here. This was an effort, people said, to civilize Native peoples. These schools were all over the country, and in many other countries. The same happened in Scandinavia to the Sami people. It happened all over Australia and so forth. And this is an example from a school at Kashina, where there were children from a lot of different nations in most of these. This was a local, mostly Menominee school, isolated people from home influence. And a huge thing was linguistic conformity, to make sure that people only spoke English. Schillinger is a historian who's written an important book about these. And Schillinger quotes somebody who was a student saying, if we were caught speaking our language, we were punished severely. We might get a kerosene shampoo or a bar of yellow soap shoved in our mouth. That was just part of it. And things were often worse than that. But while this has led to the endangerment of almost all native languages in North America, there's there's a part of the story that's really about resilience. What's happening today is that we're getting huge amounts of work done by people who are known as language warriors to revitalize indigenous languages. Waduka Dading is an Ojibwe language immersion school at Lakuta Ray, where traditional culture and values are taught alongside the usual school curriculum. And it's not just in those sorts of situations. We're starting to see indigenous languages be more publicly visible in ways that they weren't for a long time. This is a billboard on the Menominee Reservation, and it says Sakaksamawao Pon Manenon. He makes an offering of tobacco, don't drink, meaning don't drink alcohol. Mothers Against Drunk Driving went to the Menominee Nation and said they would make a billboard and they could put the language on it that they wanted. And that's what they chose, something that emphasized traditional cultural values and addressed the issue of alcohol. Even on the Madison campus now, we're starting to see indigenous languages. So for the 2021 graduation, we put up signs in all of Wisconsin's languages. I'm using the Menominee example here because I can pronounce them. I don't speak any of the others. I don't speak Menominee, but I know a few words. Kinehek Tamawao means congratulations in the plural. And this is done by a group called Inwejig, which is the Ojibwe for those who speak. So we're starting to see a resurgence in terms of learning and using these languages in ways that's extremely encouraging. And the future in some ways is looking brighter and brighter. 4 years ago, the Menominee started a daycare immersion classroom. The teachers are second language learners, but extremely proficient. I had the chance to take a class, Menominee class last semester with one of their teachers. He's really a very good speaker. What's happening is that these little kids are now up to 4 years old, so they're toddlers. They hear only Menominee at school, so they're learning Menominee. They're speaking Menominee, using Menominee with each other and with their teachers. So I think it's a really powerful story of resilience, and people who work in these communities 15, 20 years ago were often very pessimistic. There's now a whole lot of real optimism today. So to turn to earlier immigrant languages, the immigrant languages that people really often associate stereotypically with Wisconsin. One of the questions is what do we know about these earlier communities and how do we know it? And this is something that came, that we learned about from our outreach talks, where somebody said, well, my grandfather came to Manitowoc in the 1880s and he learned English instantly. Why don't these immigrants today do that? And we knew that the second half of that was wrong. Immigrants today are learning as fast as they possibly can, but we didn't know anything about the earlier immigrants. It turns out there's a way to find out. The 1910 census asked a question that you can see on the screen, whether people were able to speak English, and if they couldn't, what language they spoke. So that doesn't tell us if you're bilingual. If you speak Polish and English, English is listed for you. But if you can't speak English, they list the language you speak. So here's a page of census data from Sharon, Wisconsin, a little bit south of Stevens Point. And of course, the census gives us more data than just a person's name. If you see those three central columns, they are place of birth of this person, place of birth of father of this person, place of birth of mother of this person. If you look at these three, the highlighted set, these are third generation Wisconsinites who, sorry, the box moved, it should be down one thing. These are third generation Wisconsinites who reported being unable to speak English. They spoke only Polish. So our initial work was in eastern Wisconsin with German speakers, and we found situations like this where a quarter of Eustisford in Dodge County, not too far south of you, could only speak German, and a whole lot of those people were US born. The ones who had immigrated were typically had been there more than 30 years. And it wasn't just as we might have thought, in fact, as we expected, that these would be farmers and people who lived in isolation. They included some of the most important people in the community and also people who had a lot of public contact. Here's just a table of what it looks like across a lot of different communities. And you see a lot of communities had large numbers of US-born monolinguals, and there are also high percentages of monolinguals. You'll hear more about that in a minute from Mirva in particular. One of the things that is very interesting, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want, is it turns out the youngest speakers in a lot of different communities were all born in the 1940s. It varies a little bit, but it's really a pretty tight clustering there. So that tells us when these languages stopped being transmitted, when people became English monolinguals. Now, of course, immigration has continued. Immigrants and refugees have continued to come in, and it's a very different situation today. I'll give a couple of examples here from education, the Hmong English bilingual programs in Madison, and a Spanish English dual immersion school in Green Bay. These are, of course, all over the state, and they involve lots of different languages. One of the things that people ask about, and there's been an object of study in recent years, is whether a concern from some parents has been whether kids who go to a dual language school are going to fall behind in English, whether they're going to be behind in, say, reading English. There's a good bit of work on this now, and the answer is really very straightforward. these kids do better in reading English than their monolingual peers. In 5th grade, they're about 7 months ahead. In 8th grade, they're 9 months ahead in English reading skills. So I think this is very important for thinking about the future of bilingual education. Just very quickly, this is a map. We can come back to it in the Q&A if there's time, that shows the change in Portage and Marathon counties, where the filled in letters indicated growth of a population and the open ones indicate a decrease. So in these very communities that used to be very heavily Polish and German speaking, we're seeing now a real rise in Hmong and Spanish, and as the older generations of German and Polish speakers pass on. And it's worth noting that there are more languages coming into the state. I don't know if anybody recognizes the language at the bottom of that sign, which is in English and Spanish and another language. Not seeing anything in the chat. It is Somali. There's a growing Somali community in Barron, people who've come over from the Twin Cities to work in the Gineo, originally to work in the Gineo turkey plant there. So my last point before I turn it over to Mirva is just how and why people switch from one language to another. People in Wisconsin, Josh Brown at UW-Eau Claire, and a group of us at Madison, and some people who used to be at Madison, have been working on a model just called the verticalization model of shift. And the core of it is this. In the 19th century, communities were very horizontally organized. What happened in local schools and religious institutions and the local economy were very tightly interconnected. People took off holidays for the local religious customs, and around the local economy, people would take off for harvest and so forth. Increasingly over time, though, those have become vertical relationships. So the State Board of Education has a lot more to say about what happens in local schools than they used to. I won't go through these quotes, but the history of Wisconsin, this is a theme that runs through their volumes of how important it was to people to be able to control their own local institutions. It's the erosion of that control that correlates with shift in these communities where people switch increasingly to English. So with that, I will turn it over to Mirva Johnson. Mirva is a heritage speaker of Finnish herself and has been working on Finnish, as she'll explain to you. She's just about to leave us for a year to go to Helsinki, where she's got a Fulbright and another very high-powered fellowship to study and come back and finish her dissertation here. So Mirva, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you, everybody. As like Joe said, I have focused most of my work on research of the Finnish of heritage speakers, specifically in the upper Midwest. And so the majority of Finnish speakers to the United States immigrated from the 1880s to the 1920s. And this was a couple decades after most of the other Scandinavian and Western European immigration in the early to mid 19th century. Today, though, I want to focus on one community in northern Wisconsin and their language situation. So Oulu, Wisconsin, got its start in 1889 when the first homestead was filed. And then over time, more settlers joined, most from Europe, but the majority were from Finland, until Oulu applied and became its own township in 1904. And so most Finnish immigrants to Oulu and other upper Midwestern towns came from Western Finland, including where you can find present-day Oulu, as well as southwestern Finland. And so residents of the community say that the name started as Oulu, but has shifted to Oulu for many, just as residents shifted in favor of using English over time. And so there are several ways to examine language shift in communities, as Joe highlighted for you all. Some of the major ones are looking at old newspapers, local histories, and other written documents. So Peltojakoti, the newspaper image you see here, is one of several Finnish American newspapers that circulated in the early 1900s. and it had many readers, especially in northern Wisconsin and in Oulu specifically. This paper was written almost entirely in Finnish with just a few advertisements in English. And so moving on from that, I examined census data. So as Joe outlined, we can use census data to look at reported counts of language ability in a community. And so I examined census data from 1910 and 1920 for Oulu with an eye to Finnish immigration and language usage. There was a population rise between 1910 and 1920, and the percentage of foreign-born Finns increased, and many of those immigrants were monolingual Finnish speakers. And so now I'm going to give you a bit of a visual demonstration with this next slide to show you some of the things that we can deduce from census data. So here you see the 1920 census showed that out of Oulu's 1,077 residents, 344 were immigrants born in Finland. And so here on the slide, you can see 344 people represented. Between 1910 and 1920, 36 individuals immigrated to Wisconsin from abroad, and 31 of them from Finland. So 31 of them were relatively recent arrivals to Wisconsin, those pictured here. And then next though, 20 out of those 31 reported not being able to speak English. So if we further recognize that in the 1920 census, 168 Finnish immigrants reported not being able to speak English. So now combining that together, if we subtract the 20 Finnish immigrants who could not speak English that came between 1910 and 1920, then we are left with 148 Finnish immigrants who came to America before 1910 and reported not being able to speak English as of the 1920 census collection. So this means that 43% of Finnish immigrants in Oulu reported not being able to speak English, even after having lived in America for at least 10 years. So this suggests a slowness to learn English, and further that knowledge of English was by no means a necessity for survival in this community. And so census data can be really useful in putting numbers to ideas like everybody used to speak Finn in the old days. Well, we can have a count of that number there. But beyond direct reports of language ability, census data can be powerful and useful for determining things more indirectly related to language use, like changes in employment. So I've been using this data to further look at different categories of employment and changes over time in Oulu. The idea being that life modes and employment essentially determines your social network, or the people that you interact with on a daily basis, which then in turn determines which languages you use. So shifts in life mode or occupation will ultimately impact language usage. So while farmers tended to supplement their income in this area with seasonal labor in lumber camps and on docks in this area in particular, on the whole, those who were farming relieved the community less than those who commuted daily for wage labor employment. And so the main thing I want you to get out of this chart is in these 4 boxes, red there, is so you can see how the percentage of those employed as farmers increased from 1910 to 1930, after which time there was a decline. And this strong percentage of farmers was especially high for the region, because if we compare to the neighboring community of Maple, they already had a large decrease in farming already by 1940. So this shows that what happened in Oulu wasn't necessarily the case everywhere in the area at the same pace. And so another way to address questions of language usage and change is to speak with those who live in the community today and who remember what things were like decades before, as well as by interviewing those who grew up speaking both English and the heritage language, Finnish in this case. So I've been speaking with people in many Finnish American communities, many from Oulu, and asking them questions about what it was like growing up in Oulu, when they remember using Finnish in school, church, at the store, etc., and then when they use Finnish nowadays, if at all. I also ask questions to look at specific linguistic nuances of heritage Finnish to see if and how it has developed differently from the Finnish that was spoken in Finland. So here I'm going to highlight one task that I use during my interviews, which is this frog story narrative task. And this is a children's book that has no words, only pictures about a little boy and his frog, a little boy and his dog searching for his frog. It's been used in research on several other languages, with speakers who are both monolingual and bilingual. And it's especially great to look at case usage because there's a lot of things that are inside of others, coming out of places, falling into ponds, crawling over logs, etc. And these are all phrases that are marked by different case endings in Finnish in particular. So I usually ask participants to tell the story of what happens in the book as if they're telling the story to their grandkids, but I want them to tell it in Finnish. And so with this example, I'm playing this, Joe is playing this, I should say, in part to emphasize that it's not like heritage speakers are all speaking English with a few Finnish words, they're speaking Finnish. And so, thanks, Joe.
Tuolla on kaikki noita sammakot on puurangon päällä ja ne on safe.
And so from my interviews, I've noticed some influence of English or possibly Swedish or possibly an older dialect of Finnish. Some words were identified by speakers as Finglish, and most identified them as not real Finnish and generally avoided using them if they could remember the proper Finnish word. This is interesting though, because Betty and Pottu, this list there, are perfectly acceptable in many dialects of Finnish, yet many speakers identified them as Finglish and some tried to correct their utterances after using these words. So some other examples where you may be able to see the English influence, even if you don't speak Finnish, include kukata, which means to cook, thanks. And then butcheri, which is a butcher. And then werita, which is to worry. So some of those Finglish examples there. And now to conclude, the community of Ulu is organized differently today than it was when first founded because of economic and social shifts that started happening already in the mid-1900s, this verticalization that Joe mentioned earlier. So folks at the Ulu Cultural and Heritage Center are working to understand and document the past and present of their community and to create a community space where everyone can gather. I've been working closely with them, and it's through their generous support that I was able to conduct most of my interviews in the first place. In addition to conducting interviews, we did a talk up there, pretty similar to this one, about heritage languages in the state of Wisconsin, past and present. And I also volunteered with their summer school program, which is partnered with their local South Shore School District. And I taught a few Finnish lessons during their annual week focused on local culture and heritage. And I've been helping out with that week for the year since, though it hasn't happened recently because of COVID, unfortunately. So all that to say, while Finnish may not be spoken regularly in the community anymore, it still plays a role in the way that they are constructing and performing identity, along with other aspects of Finnish American culture like foods, music, and dress. And I think Rachel will take it from here and talk about some of these ideas with Heritage Dutch.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Rachel Hippus is going to talk to us about her work on Dutch community she's from. And she's just now starting graduate school at Madison, but she did her undergraduate at UW-Eau Claire and worked with Josh Brown and got started on Dutch already. So she's, even before she's actually officially on campus, she's able to help us out with this. So it's all yours, Rachel.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. As you said, today my part of the talk is going to be focusing on Dutch, and specifically the Dutch found in the Fox cities of Wisconsin, just right up the highway from you guys on 41. So now there are definitely more people of Dutch descent in Wisconsin and even other large groups where people settled, but I focus on this particular group, as Joe said, because it's where I'm from, but also because it's different from a lot of the other groups of Dutch settlers that came to Wisconsin, and also Dutch settlers that came to the US in general. This is because this group of settlers in the Fox cities was predominantly Catholic and immigrated from the Catholic southern province of Noord-Brabant, which I circled on the slide. Most of the other groups of Dutch settlers instead were Protestant and immigrated from the more Protestant northern portion of the Netherlands. So this difference in religion is interesting because in immigrant language research, we have come to know that religion often plays an important role in language maintenance. And so this difference between this particular Dutch group and other Dutch groups could then mean that it played a different role in their language maintenance as well. So now diving right in, the Dutch language has actually been maintained in this community for a rather long time. The first immigrants settled the area beginning in 1848, with more immigrants following soon after, as well as after each of the world wars. A few speakers of the language can still be found today, whether they be immigrants from after World War II, the children of those immigrants, or even amazingly descendants of the earlier generations who managed to continue passing the language on to their children, even as English became the dominant language of the community around them. That being said, the language is more or less on its last leg in the community. The speakers that I've studied so far are more than likely going to be the last that do speak Dutch. This is why my research actually focuses on two different types of individuals. Those, like I mentioned, who learned the language as children and are able to use both Dutch and English to talk about a different number of things, and also those who only have a passing knowledge of a few things in Dutch, especially those related to culture. When a language gets to this point, we can classify it as a post-vernacular language. That means that it's no longer used as the language of communication in the community. It's unlikely to be heard at the grocery store or the bank or on the street. But by members of the community, it can still be used in small bits and pieces as a means to show their identity and to connect with the culture. This term was actually first used to describe Yiddish in the US and has been used to describe the situation of several other language situations, both in the US and around the world. So kind of as Mirva mentioned a little bit in her talk, we use many different methods to study both the last generation of bilinguals as well as post-vernacular languages. A lot of this research involves interviewing people and asking them about their personal history with the language, when they used to use it, when they use it now, what words they actually use, and perhaps what aspects of the language they use with their children or even grandchildren. It also involves looking for other places where language might be used to express identity, such as through tourism and different attractions and events, the signs of the community, and even cookbooks. So when I went to the Fox Cities to conduct my fieldwork in 2018, I actually found that a lot of Dutch is still present in the landscape of the community. The use of Dutch last names in business and park signs is especially common, as you can see with the Van Zeeland's Auto Care Center and Van Lieshout Park signs on the slide. The use of Dutch symbols, such as windmills, tulips, and wooden shoes, is also frequent. And in Holland Town, they even have a sign advertising their annual Dutch cultural event, the Shoot, whose name comes from Dutch as well, and the cultural practice is a Dutch cultural practice. And then for those individuals who do use the language post-vernacularly, so the bits of language they know and use tend to pertain to two topics in particular, those being food and family. So the people we interviewed fondly recalled Dutch recipes their parents or even grandparents would make, one of the most common being a dish which has multiple different names depending on what exactly goes into it and where exactly your ancestors are from. So this could be patuzzi, vruchstomp, stompot, or hutspot, all more or less a meat and potato and vegetable mash, though those have variation. In looking at the locally published Dutch cookbook, which is Dutch Delights on this slide, we also found language for other recipes such as oya soup, onion soup, and rode kool, which is red cabbage. And additionally, our interviewees also talked about how they continue to use Dutch for terms referring to family members, especially those who spoke or continue to speak Dutch themselves. So I have oma and opa for grandma and grandpa, and tante for aunt. And then lastly, my research also focuses on measuring accentedness, especially in the speakers who grew up speaking Dutch as their first language and learned English later on. What exactly do I mean by accentedness? So what I do is I take the recordings of the speakers like we get from the interviews or from our frog stories, and I put them into a program, which I've put a screenshot of on the slide. And this allows me to measure different characteristics of that person's speech. I specifically look at the aspects of speech which are known to be different between Dutch and English, and I do this to see whether an immigrant who has lived in the US for 50 years is starting to sound more American-like, whether their children have an American accent in their Dutch or a Dutch accent still in their English, and things such as this. And I can also compare the speech between different generations to get an idea of whether the language is changing over time. By taking these measurements, so I can take measurements of vowel pronunciation or consonant duration, I can get an idea of how their speech differs from other people living in the same area, and also whether we're seeing similar things happening in this and other immigrant groups. Then just to kind of conclude, so before I pass the baton back to Joe, I just want to say a short word about why we do this research. So for us, it's a lot about learning about how languages are learned, how they're lost, and also how bilinguals manage the two different languages that they have swirling around in their heads. But kind of as Mirva mentioned, we also like to make sure that the communities are also getting something out of the research we do as well. And for the communities, it's often about helping them gain a greater understanding of their community's history and also about their identity, which is invaluable. So passing the baton back to Joe then.
Thank you very much. So just to conclude, we're linguists. We're used to thinking about how many languages and dialects there are and how rich the linguistic world is. But we're just constantly in awe of how much richness there is in this state and how dynamic it is. We've got new languages and speakers, but as you just heard from Mirva and Rachel, there's not just documentation, but new kinds of understanding of earlier historical languages. The revitalization of indigenous languages is really beyond what a lot of people were dreaming about not that long ago. A big thing that you saw throughout all of the presentations is how much we can learn from the past that informs how we understand the present. So changes in immigrants learning English, they used to not learn very fast, they now learn as fast as they can, why people shift languages, and how languages remain present even after they're not the widely spoken language in a community. And we didn't even say anything about how these languages have shaped English in Wisconsin. So with that, Wewanen, thank you. I guess we could say it in all 4 languages, but maybe not. We're happy to take your questions. And you can enter things in the chat, or Josh, I don't know if it's possible for people to unmute themselves and ask questions.
Yes, I believe you can unmute yourself to ask a question if you'd like.
And I know that Mirva has to go soon, so questions for Mirva. Yeah, so she can stay for a couple of minutes. So if you have a question for Mirva, please jump up and ask fast.
This is Rebecca Duran. I have a question, but probably not for Mirva. So if someone has a Mirva question first.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to say thank you to you all for your work on preservation of language and culture. Something that I'm really interested in. Definitely don't have it as my career, but certainly interested. I live in northeastern Wisconsin, and I actually wanted to particularly to address you, Joe, because I'm like a lot of people, you know, an ethnic mutt, right? I have several backgrounds, but I always had an interest in languages, including French and many others, but also my grandparents spoke Walloon.
Yep.
And so I wasn't able to finally connect with someone to start learning it till about 3 years ago, someone locally, when I had someone who's willing to teach and learn and all that kind of thing. And in that process, you know, we discovered, as you know, that there was very little out there for materials because it's an oral language only in Wisconsin. And so anyways, I just wanted to share with you the project that I started as a volunteer and still as. In these classes, no one was really recording things. So I started teaching everyone how to record stuff on their cell phones. I created a Google Drive. None of it's, thank you. I was like, oh my God, there's no recordings. I mean, yes, there are some at the university, but in terms of like, you know, vocabulary, that kind of thing, simple sentences. So I created a Google Drive for people to use to some degree. Then kept thinking like there's got to be more we can do. And yes, Josie Watlet had been doing things. You know, I started to become aware of Kelly Beer's research, but in my mind, there wasn't something for adult learners as well as people who weren't in the area, right? And people have scattered all over the place. So I happened to chance upon someone named Vinny Champeau at a friend's party. He was a yoga instructor, and he's a polyglot interested in language, and he has a website called Anki Master, and he has been willing to partner with me. So essentially what myself and 2 other people from the Brussels area have done is meeting with our some of our very few native speakers to, at Vinny's suggestion, to record, we're halfway through, 3,000 sentences and 600 words. And then in that program of his, it would essentially be a housing for people to anywhere on a computer, look at a word, look at a sentence, hear the recording, and then the part that is obviously beyond my head is translating that to the IPA so that it's essentially preserved and everyone from other countries can use it, right?
Yep.
So the good news on the project is that we just applied for a grant. I wrote the grant and for the beginning of the month and this last month, and we'll find out in September, and then whatever we don't get, we'll be applying for another grant to hopefully make the balance. But essentially, this electronic program, when it's finished, will have all these edited words and phrases, and it'll have the IPA, which Kelly Beers will is interested in doing for us. And then the system will create flashcards so you can test yourself. So I wanted to share that with you guys to let you know that there's an, so to speak, an amateur effort to collect and preserve and create a teaching tool up here. And I would like to actually get your book. I had done some research to find out who's doing linguistic stuff. And even though Kelly's in North Carolina, it seemed probably to make most sense with his background for him to work with us. But I saw your Wisconsin book, Wisconsin Talk Linguistic Diversity in the Badger State, and I'd like to get a copy somehow.
Well, we'd like to do another version because at that point, nobody was working with Walloon, nobody
Really?
was working with Somali, nobody was working with Dutch and so forth, and things have changed dramatically. So there's a need basically for a whole new book, and I think young people like Rachel and Mirva are going to be the ones who take the next step, and Kelly will surely be involved. I would just say that we don't think of people like you as amateurs. We think of you as community scholars, and you know tons of stuff that we don't know. It's rare for there to be somebody like Rachel who's from the community working with the community. It's even rare for there to be a heritage speaker of a language working with a language, like Mirva's a heritage speaker of Finnish. So that's outstanding. Thank you and congratulations. If there's anything I can do to help, drop me a line. I, of course, know Kelly well. So that's just great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And yeah, it's just a fascinating thing, and a topic that's really beloved to us, with any language. And I'm very, whether it's Finnish or whether it's, native, indigenous, when you lose a language, you lose a culture. And so whatever you can do across the board to preserve, languages and enable them to be revitalized or at least recorded, in some way is great.
Thank you. Becky had her hand up. Is anybody have a question for Mirva? If so, I ask you to jump in right now before she has to leave. Okay, then if not, then we'll just go in order. Becky, I think you were next.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you very much. The talk was very interesting. I'm Mexican. I speak Spanish, and I am learning English, and I think it's super interesting. I couldn't imagine how many languages are around the state. Of course, I know a lot of Hispanic people, and I was wondering if there's some research about that. Probably not too deep, but yeah, I will like to be involved in some of the studies that you have, if you have one or you are thinking in some Spanish thing. I tried to set up my camera. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I couldn't do it. Something happened with my computer. So thank you. Thank you. I will let you my personal email just in case something came up. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of work happening with Spanish speakers in Wisconsin right now. We have a set of very good linguists at Madison and other campuses in the state who specialize in Spanish. Kathy Stafford, a colleague here, has been working on differences in how Spanish is spoken by people who come as adults versus people who come as children and people who are born here. And there is a lot of interesting development. for a long time, people talked about bilinguals, immigrants and otherwise, as in terms of what they had not learned, that people might have a bigger vocabulary in one language than the other. But what we've seen today is that bilinguals are doing a whole lot more than monolinguals are, obviously. And we see that people who are being raised here, born and raised here in a heavily English-speaking environment, that they still have a lot of Spanish language skills, and it creates a very good foundation for them to go back and learn later if they don't have a chance in school to read and write. But all of the evidence points toward the value of keeping multiple languages and keeping people bilingual as long as we possibly can. So thank you. Yes, drop me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, and I can put you in touch with some of the folks who are working on Spanish in Wisconsin. And oops, sorry, that let me try again. But it's of course not just people speaking Spanish, with people from especially southern Mexico and further south in Central America. Of course, there are large numbers of speakers of indigenous languages like Mixteco and various Mayan languages from Guatemala and from Chiapas in southern Mexico. And there's a lot of interest in those languages. So people who are coming already bilingual or trilingual, people who speak Mixtec and Spanish, and then learn English on top of it. And that's something where there's a lot of work to be done. Did I answer all of your question? I hope so. Okay. Then
Yes, thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thanks for coming. So Robert Humphreys is talking about Welsh speakers. That's a really, in Wisconsin, although there were lots of Welsh speakers here, really understudied community. And Robert's asking about whether there are big gender differences, noting that there are indications that women refuse to speak English. Yes, this has been a constant topic of discussion for decades, and it looks like things differ by community. In some communities, you have gender asymmetries that go one way or the other. In some cases, so with our German communities, we found that women were much more likely to be monolingual than men. So in some cases, 2/3 of the monolinguals were women and 1/3 were men. Some of this is economic, but that also varies dramatically. And I did my graduate work in Texas at the University of Texas at Austin, and there's a long tradition of studying languages in Texas, and even with Spanish in Texas, which has a history that goes back long before Texas was part of the United States, of course. There were different opinions and different communities. Some people would say, oh, in this community, the men are much more likely to be Spanish monolingual, and women are much more likely to be bilingual. In other communities, it was vice versa. So I think this has to do with with the social setting, and also it ties into the verticalization arguments that I was talking about. So we, in terms of whether women's more home-based social roles, at least traditionally, of course, made it easier to avoid adopting English. When Miranda Wilkerson and I did our first paper on immigrants in the old days not learning English, we sat down as we started to analyze the data and talked about, okay, what do we expect? What do we think we're going to find? And one thing we thought we would find was that women who were geographically more isolated would be most likely to be monolingual. That turned out to be completely wrong. there were as many monolingual people in towns as there were out in the country, and so forth. And as I showed in the one slide, there are a lot of people who were actively engaged in commerce and in other professions that involve a lot of contact with a lot of other people. So it's much more complicated. It's something we don't know much about yet, and it looks like it's very different in different different communities. Robert, did that get the core parts of your question answered?
Yes, I'm going to jump in and just say thank you. Yes, I've been looking for an answer to that question for quite a while.
It's a complicated question. So Jennifer asked, or says, I know the Hmong language didn't have a written form until recent decades. Do you know, was that written form developed here in the US, or did it also come over from Asia? There is a really amazing book that I have on the shelf here called The Mother of Script, that tells the story of writing the Hmong language. Yes, it developed in Asia and came over, and it's a really remarkable story. If you email me, I can send you the full reference to it. It's a short book. It's an easy read, and it's a really nice story. Of course, languages are traditionally not written, right? They're spoken, and it's still the case in huge numbers of languages of the world that most people don't. A lot of people don't read and write the languages that they speak. That's true for a lot of languages that are found in Wisconsin, including things were called dialects of other languages. So Walloon is a separate language, but some people still think of it as a dialect of French because they just don't know. Walloon has been written for a while, but a ton of languages haven't been. The indigenous languages have been written for a long time now. For Menominee, for example, we have records going back 150 years or something. But it's a I would just urge you to read that book. It's a really interesting read. That probably covers your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, and I will just email me, and I will send you the full reference to it.
Will do. Thanks so much.
And if anybody hasn't seen, there's a note from Robert in the chat about people who are interested in Welsh. And again, I think that we have come to understand the incredible value that community scholarship and community scholars do, both in terms of history, in terms of language documentation, and so forth. This is really valuable work, and I encourage people to do it. And we have a huge set of people on campus here who are interested in all sorts of languages. Just contact me and I can put you in touch with students or faculty who would be interested in and able to help you. Carla has a hand up.
Yes, apropos of nothing, probably. I just wanted to mention an interesting observation I've had lately about a venue where people are learning their ancestral languages anew is through genealogy. And Ancestry and some of the other big portals have played a part in this. But so my biggest ancestral language is Dutch. I'm from one of the Protestant communities, Rachel. And but it's on both sides of my family, the other group's in Iowa. But I made connection with a genealogist in the Netherlands because they have such amazing genealogical records. And there's just a gigantic community, as we already know, researching family history, probably made much larger by the pandemic. But people are connecting with native speakers that way, and they're also, learning, not conversational language, but genealogical, hobby language as they go through their research. But I do see a whole lot of connection with people finding native researchers, native speakers in, the quote unquote old world. And starting to take up the language, which to me is just really interesting. I learned, you know, family language and cooking language from my own grandparents, just smatterings of it and hymns, that kind of thing. But now I'm learning actual Dutch, and I just thought that was, you know, whatever. I thought it was a thought.
Rachel, do you want to speak to that as someone learning Dutch too?
Yeah, so I know I definitely learned a whole lot about like my own heritage, and specifically like you can figure out which specific area of the Netherlands your ancestors come from, because the Netherlands also has 23 main dialects that break down into even more dialects depending on what region you're from. So you can kind of figure out what specific dialect your ancestors would have spoken to, which I think is really interesting. And I know there are a couple groups of genealogists that actually will come over from the Netherlands to the US to meet with people and figure out different language things, and to get some of the records that we have here to find. So there's a really good exchange, like back and forth, I feel like. So yeah, it's a really good point that genealogy is actually a really good way to figure out more about language.
Absolutely. This is one of the first places where I think some people realized how valuable community scholars are. When I started working on German spoken in Texas in the late 1970s and the 1980s, I would ask people where their families had come from in Germany, and they didn't know, or they only knew sort of vaguely. Sometimes towns would make town sister city type relationships with somebody in the region and so forth. But by the time I came to Wisconsin in the 1990s, we went into towns and asked people, Norwegian speakers or German speakers or whatever, do you know where your ancestors came from? And people would pull out genealogy, huge sheafs of genealogy papers, and tell us everything. That's incredibly important. Rachel mentions dialect variation across the Low Countries. It's the same in most of these countries. And we see all sorts of interesting mismatches. People don't talk like people in the region that their ancestors came from did. And that gives us a lot to figure out about what's changed, how people have come to speak different dialects. So with Norwegian, for example, some of the communities in Western Wisconsin, Westby and so forth, were heavily settled by people from Eastern Norway in the mountains north of Oslo. But there are people from other dialects, and sometimes those dialects have remained, and sometimes those people have switched to speak a very, very different kind of Norwegian than their families did. And it has all sorts of very interesting implications. There's a very famous linguist, Einar Haugen, who was a Norwegian English bilingual and did recordings in the 1940s of Norwegian speakers. And in one of his recordings, he's interviewing a guy named Valdemar von Ruden, which is not a very Norwegian sounding name. And he says, so where's your family from? And the guy says in perfectly native-like Eastern Norwegian, according to Eastern Norwegians. I'm not that good in Norwegian, but he said, oh, my father was from Germany and my mother was from Waukesha County. And he said, so what did you speak at home? He said, oh, well, we spoke German at home. So how did you learn Norwegian? So, well, everybody speaks Norwegian here. It's a Norwegian settlement. I had to speak Norwegian. And he says that sort of modestly, and you think, oh, maybe it's not that good. But I went around to a bunch of Norwegian dialectologists and said, how good is his Norwegian? And said, oh my God, he sounds like he's from Eastern Norway. So there's huge amounts of important data that we get that way. Thank you. Any more questions? Not seeing anything more in the comments. If anybody has questions later or wants any kind of follow-up, just drop me a line. I put my my email in the chat. It's not hard to find me. And like I said, I can put you in touch with people. There's tons of interesting stuff going on across Wisconsin with community people and with researchers as well, university researchers as well. So thank you all for coming and for staying for a nice long Q&A. Really appreciate it.
And on behalf of the library, thank you so much for coming and doing the presentation and giving us your time tonight, Joe and Rachel and Mirva as well. Give her our thanks. Thanks to the Badger Talks program and for everybody who joined us tonight. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Thank you.